Does a tree become more beautiful if we say that God created it? Does a proverb become more true if we think God is the author? Is a person, a loved one, less dead if we believe in an afterlife? Should we thank God or the farmer for our food? Is the food we give the hungry more nutritious if we give it in the name of God? Should we blame God or evolution for creating smallpox? Should we praise God or modern medicine for eliminating its natural threat? Is killing inherently wrong, or just because God said, "Thou shalt not kill"? Does a baby become more lovable if we say it was created in the image of God? What does God add to the equation of our life? Is God the source of all? An all-powerful God is deemed to be responsible for beauty, truth, life, death, food, charity, illness, healing, morality, and love. Yet some see these qualities as part of the human condition. By saying that God is all-powerful, are we denying our own power? Is God the creator of beauty, or is beauty in the eye of the beholder? These are the types of questions that attracted me to Unitarian Universalism. And that UUs each have the right to answer these questions in their own way is what keeps me here. These are the questions brought on by humanism, a theory that humans are responsible for themselves and not a supernatural being. In the late 18th and early 19th century, Unitarians and Universalists were basically liberal Christians. They denied the orthodoxy that humans were basically sinful. They saw Jesus as the perfect human reflection of the image of God, and that by following the teachings of Jesus, all people could reflect divinity. In the mid-19th century, this was challenged by the Transcendentalists, who said that religion was bigger than Christianity, and that we should discard the old language and find God communing with nature. This is nature spelled with a capital N. This was not a scientific or rational view of nature, but an emotional, mystical concept. But in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the scientific perspective grew. According to Edwin H. Wilson, in his book, The Genesis of a Humanist Manifesto, Raymond Bragg, the secretary of the Western Unitarian Conference, organized the effort to create the Humanist Manifesto. In 1932, he asked Roy Wood Sellers to write a draft resolution, which was edited and signed by various Unitarian ministers such as Curtis Reese and non-Unitarians such as philosopher John Dewey. The Humanist Manifesto was released 80 years ago, in 1933. It expressed the views of a growing minority of Unitarians and a smattering of some Universalists, as well as speaking to those outside of organized religion. Through the mid-20th century, it became the majority belief in our denomination. In the late 20th century, our denomination started exploring feminist theology and neo-paganism, and humanists are no longer the majority of UUs, yet they still account for the largest segment of our population. To track the evolution of this change, this morning I'm going to look at 3 documents. First, the Humanist Manifesto, published in 1933, the Humanist Manifesto II, published in 1973, and Religious Humanism, an essay written in 2000 by William Murray, the Dean of Meadville Lombard, our UU seminary in Chicago. Now, due to the limitation of time, I will be severely editing these documents. So I encourage to read them, that you read them in your entirety. When this comes out on email, they'll be cited. They're pretty easy to find on the web and in the library. And I'm going to skip preambles and conclusions and kind of just focus on the points that each of these documents contain, and even those that are edited. But as I read these points, listen. Don't try to keep track and take notes, but just listen. And be aware of what you think and feel. Do you agree or disagree? Do the words give you a sense of freedom from religion, or do they miss the whole point of what religion means to humanity? Are they optimistic or are they pessimistic? I begin from the Humanist Manifesto. First, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing, not created. Second, humanism believes that man is part of nature and that he has emerged as the result of a continuous process. Third, holding an organic view of life, humanists find that the traditional dualism between mind and body must be rejected. Fourth, the individual born into a particular culture is largely molded by that culture. Fifth, humanism asserts that the nature of the universe depicted by modern science makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantees of human values. Sixth, we are convinced that the time has passed for theism, deism, modernism, and several varieties of new thought. Seventh, religion consists of those actions, purposes, and experiences which are humanly significant. The distinction between the sacred and the secular can no longer be maintained. Eighth, religious humanism considers the complete realization of human personality to be the end of man's life and seeks its fulfillment and development here and now. Ninth, in the place of old attitudes involved in worship and prayer, the humanist finds his religious emotions expressed in a heightened sense of personal life and in a cooperative effort to promote social well-being. 10th, it follows that there will be no uniquely religious emotions and attitudes of the kind hitherto associated with a belief in the supernatural. 11, man will learn to face the crises of life in terms of his knowledge of their naturalness and probability. 12, believing that religion must work increasingly for joy in living. Religious humanists aim to foster the creative in man and to encourage the achievements that add to the satisfactions of life. 13th, religious humanism maintains that all associations and institutions exist for the fulfillment of human life. 14th, a socialized and cooperative economic order must be established to the end that the equitable distribution of the means of life be possible. And 15th and last, we assert that humanism will A, affirm life rather than deny it, B, seek to elicit the possibilities of life and not flee from them, and C, endeavor to establish the conditions of a satisfactory life for all, not merely the few. It's interesting to note that the manifesto was written before the rise of the Nazis, before the Holocaust, and before we dropped the atom bomb. There is a real confidence in the inevitable upward progress of humanity. The eighth statement has this optimism where religious humanism considers the complete realization of the human personality to be the end of man's life and seeks its development and fulfillment in the here and now. Very optimistic. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just been elected to his first term, and you can almost hear the strains of "Happy Days Are Here Again" as the writers felt bold enough to promote socialism. Yet nowhere do they suggest environmentalism, because human technology in this age is still seen as something that will tame nature. The elevation of reason over passion resulted in them ignoring sexuality altogether. The 1960s blew our society wide open. And on the 40th anniversary of the manifesto in 1973, a second version was published and began to reflect the rise of feminism, environmentalism, and the anti-Vietnam War movement. They support the sexual revolution but stop short of naming homosexuality as a valid expression of sexuality. In the midst of the Cold War, there's no calls for socialism. However, they were bolder in condemning supernatural religion. And this declaration coincides with the height of humanism within our denomination. First, we find insufficient evidence for a belief in the existence of a supernatural. It is either meaningless or irrelevant to the question of survival and fulfillment of the human race. Second, promises of immortal salvation or fear of eternal damnation are both illusory and harmful. Third, we affirm that moral values derive their source from human experience. We strive for the good life here and now. Fourth, reason and intelligence are the most effective instruments that humankind possesses. There is no substitute. Neither faith nor passion suffices in itself. Fifth, the preciousness and dignity of the individual person is a central humanist value. We believe in maximum individual autonomy consonant with social responsibility. Sixth, short of harming others or compelling them to do likewise, individuals should be permitted to express their sexual proclivities, to pursue their lifestyles as they desire. Seventh, to enhance the freedom and dignity of the individual, the individual must experience a full range of all civil liberties. Eighth, we are committed to an open and democratic society. Ninth, the separation of church and state and the separation of ideology and state are imperatives. 10th, Humane societies should evaluate economic systems not by rhetoric or by ideology, but by whether or not they increase economic well-being for all individuals and groups. 11, the principle of moral equality must be furthered through the elimination of all discrimination based on race, religion, sex, age, or national origin. 12, we deplore the division of humankind on nationalistic grounds. We have reached a turning point in human history where the best option is to transcend the limits of national sovereignty and move towards building a world community. This is what the religious right would refer to as the New World Order or the reign of the Antichrist, or the UN. 13th, this world community must renounce the resort to violence and force as a method of solving international disputes. 14th, the world community must engage in cooperative planning concerning the use of rapidly depleting resources. 15th, world poverty must cease. Hence, extreme disproportions in wealth, income, and economic growth should be reduced on a worldwide basis. 16th, technology is a vital key to human progress and development. Technology must, however, be carefully judged by the consequences of its use. 17th, we must expand communication and transportation across frontiers. We must learn to live openly together, or we shall perish together. As you listen to these, whether you call yourself a humanist or not, I imagine some have said, well, if that's what a humanist is, I've been calling myself the wrong thing all these years. And others saying, well, I was a theist, but gosh, this all seems to make sense to me. This is the type of tug and pull I want you to experience hearing these words. The 80s and the 90s brought change to our denomination. The role of women grew. A document such as the first Humanist Manifesto that talks about man fulfilling his destiny would never get out of committee. And the exploration of the feminist religious traditions occurred. And then there was a new environmental awareness that led some people to explore some neo-pagan ideas. And in general in our society, Christian denominations shifted to the right and became more conservative. And people like me suddenly said, if that's what's being called Christian, I'm no longer Christian. And then I came here, and who knows where I'm going to end up. But liberal Christians found that they were tolerated in this creedless faith. And this empowered UU Christians who had been dormant for decades to fight to have God mentioned every once in a while at UU services. Which brings us to the essay on religious humanism by William Murray, where it contrasts the old and the new humanism. First, the old humanism emphasized the single individual with very little emphasis on the importance of community. Contemporary religious humanism must stress the importance of the covenanted religious community. We are not independent, isolated individuals. We become individuals in community, starting with the community of the family. Second, the old humanism was exceedingly rational, often to the point of being rationalistic and ignoring the affective aspects of our humanness. Today's humanism will recognize the importance of non-rational factors in human experience. We are not only thinking beings, we are also feeling beings. Third, the old humanism was far too optimistic, seeming to ignore the reality of tragedy and evil in human nature. Religious humanism today needs to take seriously the tragic dimensions of life and the role evil often plays in human tragedies. Human beings suffer and die, sometimes prematurely and almost always before we are ready. It includes the fact of life is not necessarily meaningful and purposeful. We must create our own meaning and purpose. Fourth, the old humanism seemed closed to a sense of wonder and mystery, to any form of transcendence. The new humanism can be an open humanism, open to wonder and mystery and transcendence in a naturalistic framework. Fifth, the new humanism must be tolerant of other perspectives and willing to engage with an open mind in conversations with people who hold other perspectives. In particular, I would hate to see humanists regard Unitarian Universalist theists as somehow irrational or inferior. Sixth, the new humanism must understand and appreciate the importance of an aesthetic dimension in religion and life. He writes, and see if this sounds familiar. The old humanism gave the impression of being rather lacking in aesthetic interest. Services in explicitly humanist congregations often were simply lectures and discussion, sometimes embellished by music. Today's religious humanism can appreciate the value of art, poetry, symbols, myth, and ritual, and of music, including congregational singing, which this congregation does very nicely, I must add. I think such rituals as the lighting of the chalice at the beginning of each service and a visual symbol of the goal of enlightenment and of religious freedom through its history. I think also the ritual of sharing joys and concerns, including the lighting of a candle by the person sharing the joy and concern. I believe that the sharing of joys and concerns is important to the community of religious humanists because it is a way of building a caring community, a community that cares about humans, and that, after all, is what humanism stands for. 7, the old humanism often seemed to deify human beings and in the process ignored other values, especially the value of the natural world. Religious humanism today includes an emphasis on the environment, what our 7th principle calls the interdependent web of all existence. 8th, the old humanism was committed to social justice and to the ideals and values of democracy, but too often it dealt with social justice issues in a paternalistic way. A religious humanism for today and tomorrow must be committed to liberating oppressed people and to economic justice. We ought to have a bias towards the poor and the disadvantaged and the oppressed. It must be emphatically committed to women's rights and equality, to gay rights and equality, to economic justice and opposing racism. Humanism is by definition truly committed to the human well-being, and that means we must be socially responsive and active in the work of justice. If you've attended the General Assembly or read articles in the World, you may see some articles or lectures that claim that humanism is dying in Unitarian Universalism. But I don't believe that's true. I think humanism is freeing itself from its own dogmatism. In 1933, they declared freedom from the old forms of religion. Why would we expect humanism to cling to the language and ideas of 1933? Indeed, the second proclamation of the original manifesto plants the seeds of an evolving philosophy, saying that it believes man is part of nature and that he has emerged as a result of a continuous process. Unitarian Universalism is also a result of an evolving, continuous process. Perhaps it was necessary to declare freedom from religion, but even in the earliest document, they called themselves religious humanists. But this separation helped us to see social and ecological needs that were often ignored by traditional religion. But it also separated us from the religious impulse in humans. We have a need to speculate about those things that cannot be measured by science. What is the meaning of life, death, beauty, love? What gives us hope in humanity despite genocide, war, and poverty? Whatever it is part of the human condition. And that striving and that hope must be embraced in order for humanism to be whole. Thank you for listening to this sermon, which at times felt like the recitation of lists. But I hope that those things spark some thoughts in your mind, and I encourage you to express those thoughts now.
I think there's one more big humanist charter that's in our book. It's number 475, which has the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations, which is a tremendously humanistic statement.
Yeah. I saw in the charter, in going to my website and you look up things, and I saw the charter being condemned as humanism, and that's why we need to get out of the UN by a religious organization.
I think it's important to remember that humanism has its origins in medieval Islam and Christianity, and that it's only in the 20th century that there's been any connection between atheism and humanism. Humanism began really as a reaction against extreme asceticism and a kind of a hatred of human nature. It began as a willingness to embrace people's love for poetry and music and being together in a community. It began with people like Erasmus, who said you shouldn't beat children, you should nurture the goodness within them. So there's no contradiction, I think, between humanism and theism, really.
Charlie, in a similar vein, I had a professor many years ago who said that you were not entitled to call yourself a humanist unless you wrote poetry in Latin.
My husband beat me over the head with part of a sermon last night. I was in the kitchen having a discussion with my daughter, and I'm almost a fundamentalist humanist. was a very traditional Baptist church. And I found myself in this zone, this bubble that I had put up because I wanted to be respectful of the forms of the service. But when I said in Joys and Concerns that I really missed you guys, I wasn't kidding. I really miss the reasoned way that we approach things. I miss the laughter that we share when we at different points of view, and I don't get that anywhere else. And so I think that while Unitarian Universalism is evolving, it's changing, and that's a good thing, you know? I don't want to be stagnant. I hope we never lose that way of looking at the world without all the yeah. I mean, it's hard to say this, but I found myself really uncomfortable with the screaming and the praising and the calling the name of God when I was thinking, I would really much rather know what's in your heart than all this noise. I would like to know what you think and not all this noise, you know? So I really appreciate that about this church, and I'm going to sit down in my caveman humanitarian.
I think the movie Blues Brothers is an interesting perspective on fundamentalist Baptist churches. And whenever I think about the praise churches, I go back and I think about the Blues Brothers. And yeah, that's the way it used to be, just like the Blues Brothers. Had a lot of fun.
Just a couple of thoughts. Going through these three documents, the first document reminds me sort of like you get the Ten Commandments. Then the other documents, the first document speaks in black and white. The second and third, you're getting in all the variations of gray. And it's just like people are today. We think in gray today rather than black or white. And to some extent, it reminds me of the changes in management. When I started out in the 60s managing, I could hire and fire, and I did without even thinking. As you grow older, all of a sudden you have to get touchy-feely and all these things. You know, it's a community. You're firing a person, you're firing a family. You're, oh my God. So I retired.
Steve.
I just wanted to say that as you were going through the changes, I saw the parallelism with the Bible itself and how as translations occurred, King James's version came upon us, and the Word of God changed its own meanings and the way it's applied in everyday life. You know, so as we grow, we find many similarities with our differences.
One last.
I'll make a comment. Having been raised in the Southern Baptist tradition and having had lots of experience with the noisy churches in my post-Baptist but pre-Unitarian Universalist life, it was my experience that the people who a lot of times made the most noise and the most commotion, that spouted the most dogma, were the very same people that were trying desperately to avoid their own issues and what they really thought. I think there's a lot of value in the way that we're doing it because you can connect with who you really are and what you really think, not what you're supposed to think.
Let us conclude our service with the hymn 289, Creative Love, Our Thanks We Give.